Ling versus Wong et al.
Oh, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Counsel.
Guy Regev here of Zucker and Regev for the appellant. The case involves a then 32-year-old female. As you're
We're
all very
quite familiar
familiar
with the facts, so
I would
let's
just-
get into the legal issues.
Sure. I would just like to point out the primary issue here is still the issue of fact that exists between the experts, and that was the primary reason that the case was dismissed based on the summary judgment motion. And I just wanted to point out the two primary issues with regards to the issues of fact here, and one of them occurred on the August 6th, 2014, which was the date of delivery, and the other occurred on August 21st, 2014, which was the date of the dilation and curettage procedure. And what the experts say on the plaintiff side here, on the appellant side, is that on August 6, 2014, as you know, the issue here is Asherman syndrome or scarring of the uterus that resulted ultimately. And what they say is that on August 6, 2014, there was a delivery in which normally the placenta would be delivered and examined to make sure it is complete. And in this case, the expert says that it was not properly examined, and we know that because not only was there not sufficient record of that in the actual report, but also we know that part of the placenta was left over, was left back in the uterus itself.
So if I understand, so the issue is not necessarily whether Dr. Wong pulled or used force to deliver the placenta. The question was whether she determined that the placenta had completely been expelled, correct?
Actually, that's the second point I was going to get to, which is you needed to examine the placenta, but also, as you pointed out, during the delivery itself, our expert states that excessive force was applied to pull the placenta out, which caused there to be a disengagement tear in the umbilical cord, and that caused it to become more difficult to then deliver the placenta as well. So those two things occurred on that first date of August 6, 2014.
Can the umbilical cord separate without being pulled?
No. What you're supposed to do is actually wait, according to, again, we have that in the expert affirmation, is to wait for a certain amount of time. I believe it was 15 minutes or so, and that way it is supposed to come out on its own. If you don't
I
wait...
don't think you understood the question. My colleague, I believe, was asking whether the umbilical cord would become disengaged from the placenta itself without being pulled.
The answer is no. The only way it would become disengaged is if somebody pulled on it inappropriately. You're not supposed to pull on the cord while the placenta is coming out.
Now, in the defendant's affidavit, the doctor affirmatively states that she did not pull on the umbilical cord.
Absolutely.
Okay, she says she did not, right? Your expert says the fact that it became disengaged is proof that she pulled too much.
Correct.
Other than defendant's doctor saying that she did not pull, does the affidavit in any way explain medically why there's proof that she didn't pull? Does she support, in other words, does defendant's doctor in her affidavit or in any of the defendant's expert affidavits provide a clinical reason why they believe there is proof to support Dr. Wong's assertion that she did not pull on the umbilical cord?
No, Your Honor.
So that both conclusions are just that, conclusions. Dr. Wong's conclusion that she didn't pull and your expert's conclusion that she did too much.
If I may, just to follow up on the word conclusion, and obviously it has legal ramifications in terms of saying it's conclusory, as long as, according to my understanding of the case law, as long as you're relying on the record, on facts that are in the record, in this case, the fact would be that the cord became disengaged. So our expert relied on the record and facts in the record and provided his opinion as to what the ramifications of that medically are. And the
Did this
conclusion,
patient have any pre-delivery complications with her pregnancy that would have indicated any problems with placenta, implantation, anything?
no, Your Honor.
Did she have a normal pregnancy
Yes, Your Honor.
without any issues occurring concerning the placenta, its position in the uterus, nothing?
Correct.
Okay?
And I did not get to just the second point on August 21st. I don't know how you
I'll give you 30 seconds on that.
Thank you so much. So while the first point had to do with the removal of the placenta, obviously what that led to is then the retention of the placenta, and then on August 21st, when it came down to removing that placenta, according to our expert, what was supposed to occur is that gentle curettage should have been performed to remove the remaining placenta. However, what we know based on the pathology report is that most of what was removed and was done completely inappropriately, which was, most of it was the muscular layer, which even the defendants in their depositions agreed, you are not supposed to get to that muscular layer. There are different layers to the uterus, and you're supposed to just get that first layer, not get into the actual muscular layer. That results in Asherman syndrome.
Okay. Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Your Honors.
Good
So,
afternoon.
Counsel, I want to ask you a question at the,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, did you?
Tell us who you are.
Oh, Gina Bernardi DeFalco. I represent Dr. Wong, the delivering doctor, Dr. Wan, who I don't believe plaintiffs raised any issues against, and his PC, who is vicariously liable for both Dr. Wong and Dr. Zhang.
Okay.
So Counsel, my question is, what, with respect to the examination of the placenta once it was outside of the uterus. So from what I see in the record, there's a statement that Dr. Wong examined the placenta to make sure that it was whole and that there were no retained portions of the placenta remaining within the uterus. But at the same time, there's an allegation that the placenta implanted itself inside the uterus, and that's the part that wasn't expelled. Is there an explanation for this in the record? Is this an anomaly, or is this an issue of triable fact that a jury would have to determine?
Well, first of all, the placenta is attached to the uterus, and it separates at delivery, and I think that's clear in the testimony, although I wouldn't have that specific page number. So what ended up happening in this case is she delivered the baby, she put a clamp on the part of the cord that came out with the baby, and before the placenta had a chance to expel itself, she felt in her hands that the cord had separated from the placenta. So it separated before she delivered the placenta.
So when you say
Speaks
that,
to your question, Judge Manzanet.
but when you say that, if the umbilical cord had separated, as you say, just on its own, apparently, would that umbilical cord not have fallen out of the vaginal cavity?
Well, it was, right, the cord.
Since it's still attached to the baby?
The cord is, right, the baby comes out, the cord is attached, but it had separated from the placenta.
Precisely, which means it would have come out of the body then, because it's no longer attached to the placenta.
Well, the piece that was attached to the baby came out, and then
Right.
she had to stick her hands in and deliver the placenta.
Right, but I'm saying, once the umbilical cord detaches, it comes out of the body. Correct? There's nothing holding it inside anymore.
Well, I don't know, it's not clear where along the way it detached. It broke somewhere between the baby and the placenta, so the part that
Well,
was
they would, if you get the placenta out whole, you'd be able to tell where it detached. You would be able to tell if the placenta still has the umbilical cord attached to the mass and whether the cut happens a little bit away from the placenta or at the base of the placenta.
The proof is 100% clear that it was not attached. That's why she had to go in and deliver it. I don't think there's any question there. you know, and
So it's not attached to the placenta.
it's not. It's separated from the placenta. That's why she had to go in,
And it's
take it
not
out.
attached to the baby either?
Doesn't answer my question.
Well,
Okay.
it was attached to the baby, and it only broke off at the placenta, not
It
at
just
the baby.
broke at one end.
Right.
So then what do you do? So obviously the placenta is still inside her,
Right,
right?
so she stuck her hands in, she took the placenta out, she roamed her hands around. This is all testimony that she specifically testified she remembered this birth. So any insinuation in the reply brief that this was custom and practice testimony is not true. She specifically said she remembered. That was on page 806 and 815 of the record. She took it out, she stuck her hand back in 2 times, felt around. She looked at the placenta upside down. She made sure the entire membrane is intact. This, she says, she does in every single delivery, not just ones where she has to deliver the placenta manually. Every single delivery she does.
So we go back to my original question, which is, if she examined the placenta and saw that it was whole, how is it that the placenta remains in the uterus? Is this an anomaly, or is this a question that has to be determined by a jury?
This is not a question that has to be determined by a jury. It's not even a question that has to be answered. The question is, what is the standard of care for her to do in that moment? And it's
No, but
to
the
examine.
the standard of care cannot be that portions of the placenta remain in her uterus or her vagina, right?
My expert said it was not a departure for portions to remain behind. Their expert did not dispute that at all.
But counsel, I guess the
Question
difficulty,
only-
counsel, the
Sorry.
difficulty that we're having, I'm just gonna ask it straight, is how can it be that the placenta is whole according to your doctor, and then there's evidence that there was material left behind?
The question is not, was the placenta whole? It was, did she examine it correctly? And from her examination, it appeared whole. From all the symptoms that the woman did not have in the 2 days she remained in the hospital after birth, there was no indication. My expert made it very clear there was no indication to believe that anything had been retained. Their expert didn't come back with anything. All he says is,
So it's possible
oh,
then,
she
counsel.
must not have.
So counsel, so then it's possible that your doctor, when your doctor looked at the placenta, concluded that it was whole when it wasn't.
That is true, but that doesn't address either the standard of care or causation in this case.
So the standard of care, if I'm getting you straight, according to Dr. Wong, the standard of care, if you have to manually remove a placenta from a woman's uterus, is that a hand sweep of the uterus is enough without doing a sonogram, which is the very same procedure that was used that showed the material that was left behind 2 weeks later. Had that been done in the operating room, we wouldn't be here. And this woman would still be able to have children.
That is not necessarily so. If she had, first of all, the sonogram was done because she was bleeding. She was not bleeding in the hospital. My expert said you don't do a sonogram in those situations. Their expert didn't dispute that either.
I'm sorry, was the sonogram performed after
3 weeks
the
later.
manual extraction of the
No.
placenta?
3 weeks later, when she started bleeding profusely, that was the indication. The other thing is, if a sonogram had been done, the testimony is also very clear, it's in there, it's on 827, 828. If a sonogram had been done that day, she would have still had to have a D&C, and the Asherman syndrome, as my colleague will explain, is a risk of the D&C. So
Yes,
there's no...
but are you counsel, come on. You're suggesting that having placenta material left behind that becomes necrotic is a better situation than having had the DNC immediately after the birth?
I'm suggesting...
Clearly, that is not the case. The faster you get this material out, the better outcome you are going to have a chance of having.
There is nothing in the plaintiff's expert affidavit that says any of that. I made my prima facie showing. It was his burden to raise an issue of fact. He didn't. He didn't do that. He didn't put any of those things that you're saying. The expert affidavit has none of that. The issue on the appeal was limited by their brief to one thing, whether or not the proof establishes that she examined the placenta. The proof is very clear. She went through pages and pages of testimony of how she did that. And their expert's testimony is only, she should have looked at the condyles. Doesn't explain what the condyles are, doesn't explain why her testimony shows that she didn't exhibit.
Okay. Let me hear from the other side, Counsel. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good afternoon. May it please the court. My name is Jacqueline Mandel. I represent Dr. Katie Zhang on this appeal. It's our position that the order of the court below should be affirmed. Dr. Zhang established that she treated the plaintiff pursuant to the standard of care, and in opposition, the plaintiff provided only speculative and conclusory opinions about Dr. Zhang, premised on hindsight reasoning that were insufficient to raise an issue of fact. We know that it's the rule in this court that an expert opinion is merely speculative and conclusory, and therefore of no probative value, when the expert fails to address the movement's expert's specific and detailed factual assertions. There are numerous examples of that in this case as it pertains to Dr. Zhang. A couple of quick examples would be that Dr. Zhang's expert, Dr. Grazi, opined that the standard of care in this situation requires that there be curettage until all of the products of conception are evacuated and the hemorrhage that the patient is having is stopped, and that the failure to do that can lead to hypovolemic shock and even death. The plaintiff's expert had nothing to say about that, no opposition whatsoever. Another example, Dr. Grazi opined that curettage has to be performed until the surgeon appreciates this grittiness. Some surgeons refer to that as a uterine cry. I'm not even sure if that's the right pronunciation, if it's cry or cry, but that's the word. And that tells the surgeon that, in this case, she has reached the appropriate surgical objective. She's reached the level that she needed to get to. Plaintiff's expert said nothing about that. He ignored it. Dr. Zhang's expert said that there has to, that even the most gentle curettage, which Dr. Zhang, of course, said she used in this case, can affect the basal layer of the uterus. Plaintiff's expert said nothing about that. And as my co-defendant's counsel alluded to a moment ago, Dr. Grazi also offered the opinion that up to 40% of women who have to undergo a postpartum DNC may develop Asherman syndrome, even in the best of hands. No comment from the plaintiff's counsel on that. In fact, the plaintiff's expert never offered an opinion as to what Dr. Zhang did wrong. He never criticized her choice of treatment or her decision to perform the DNC. He didn't criticize the instruments she used or the way that she used them. He never described what it is that she supposedly did wrong. And I'd like to refer this court to its own decision from 2018, cited in my brief, called Almanzar versus Rijos. I want to quote it for a second. This court held that where the plaintiff's expert fails to opine as to how or in what manner the procedure was improperly performed, the plaintiff fails to raise a triable issue of fact. That is exactly what happened in this case. That's what Judge Silva ruled, and respectfully, he was right. I'm also just going to, 2 days ago, this court happened to issue a decision in a case called Hashem versus Osorio. I sent copies of the case to both counsel. I have copies for the court if you want the physical copies. It happens that plaintiff's counsel was the appellant in that case as well. And that was also a medical malpractice summary judgment. This court found that the plaintiff failed to raise a triable question of fact, characterizing his expert's opinion as vague and conclusory, and noting that, I want to get this correct, that while the expert disagreed with the use of the treatment, the post-surgical platelet count in that case, the expert failed to explain why, which this court ruled was this is a quote, was a particular flaw where the defendant's expert offered a specific explanation on this issue, and that decision is equally applicable to this case. We gave a detailed explanation, and in response, all that we got was Dr. Zhang must have been overly aggressive because there were some myometrial cells found on pathology. And I take serious issue with what plaintiff's counsel said a few moments ago, that most of the tissue that was there was myometrial tissue. There's no support for that. The pathology report is in the record for this court. They don't tell you how much myometrium was there. They measure the total size of the placenta, which was, 77 by 15 by something. But none of it, there's no sizing on myometrial tissue. It's just some cells. All that this is some hindsight reasoning. And this court has rejected hindsight reasoning over and over and over again, where you say—
Do your experts opine that a DNC that has to be performed postpartum has a site that's more sensitive because of the recent delivery, right? So that a woman who has to have a DNC, perhaps because she is suffering from endometriosis and excessive bleeding, that uterine wall may be better able to absorb the kind of procedure that a DNC is than a uterus that has just delivered.
Correct, Your Honor. My expert said that any postpartum DNC, the tissue is necessarily much softer than it would be in the example that you posed.
Right. And especially so, as in the case here, where she is developing an infection and this material has been left behind and is now creating a massive problem inside.
Correct. She plainly has infection, as you pointed out earlier. The placenta that was removed, there was necrotic tissue, which means dead tissue.
Mm-hmm.
There was chronic inflammation, chronic infection, which my expert explained by itself, putting away the DNC may lead to Asherman's. And for all of those reasons, he reinforced the fact that up to 40% of women who have to undergo a postpartum DNC specifically, even with perfect treatment, 40% may develop Asherman's. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. Mm-hmm. My last comment here is, Your Honor, Justice Acosta, I want to refer you to your decision where you're also presiding in Cruz versus New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation, cited in my brief on the issue of hindsight. And I won't take the time, my red light is on, to read it to you, but for all of the reasons that have been discussed and for all of the precedent that this court has on the issue of conclusory experts and the improper use of hindsight reasoning, we respectfully request that the decision for Dr. Zhang be affirmed.
Thank you, Counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, you got 2 minutes, Roboto.
Thank you. A quick response regarding the pathology report findings. Just to quote from the pathology report, it actually states there was, quote, inflamed smooth muscle consistent with myometrium, and that's that layer that in counselor's own or expert affirmation, it states that you should not go past a certain layer that you can actually tell by the scraping cry, they refers to it, that you've reached that layer. So we know they agree you should not be going past that layer, yet the pathology report states there was smooth muscle consistent with myometrium and scant, very small fragments of inflamed endometrium tissue. The inflamed endometrium tissue is the tissue that was supposed to be removed. There was very small parts of that, according to the report, and therefore most of what was removed was that smooth muscle. So to say that counselor disagrees with that, there was no basis or support of that by their expert as well. With regards to any other questions, I would love to answer if there are any.
I only have one question. Defense, there's some talk in the papers about the possibility, the speculation that perhaps the placenta here was deeply entrenched into the uterine wall, and perhaps that's why it did not expose out of the body after the birth. Was there any evidence of that in the record postpartum that would have supported that this placenta had embedded itself deeper than the normal uterine wall lining?
There was not, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel.
Thank you.